Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Paolo Franco, the head of the Renewable Energy Division at the IEA. It's my honor to welcome you all to this event today. I would like, first of all, to thank the Ministry, MNRE, CEW for co-hosting this joint event with the IEA on unlocking the economic potential of rooftop solar in India. We have top-level introduction speeches for all organizations, and I thank you all to start with. I would like also to thank the international speakers that are literally ranging across all continents from Oceania to the Americas with a huge time difference. Thank you everybody for this. Without any further delay, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, the Honorable Secretary of MNRE, Sri Indu Shekhar Chaturvedi. Honorable Secretary, the floor is yours. Please activate your camera. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Paolo Frankel, head of the RE division, IEA, other distinguished participants from the IEA, Dr. Arunabh Ghosh, CEO, CEW. I'm very happy to be with you today. Today's subject is very important for the Indian renewable energy sector and the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. I thank the IEA for this workshop. As you all know, India has done quite well in the RE sector in the recent years. Our solar energy capacity addition has gone up 13 times in the last 6 years or so. Our overall RE installed capacity has gone up 2.5 times in the last 6 years. While we feel happy about these achievements, we also recognize that we have a long way to go, because we have set very ambitious goals for ourselves, including that of 175 gigawatt of RE installed capacity by 2022. And this realization goes along with the realization that the challenges of today are quite different from those we faced in our early years when we started with a very low base. Solar rooftop capacity addition is a critical element of our plans to achieve our targets. And in this sector, we all know that costs have declined very steeply in the last few years. Solar rooftop generation costs today in several states are lower than commercial and industrial retail tariffs. And if the electricity generated can be sold or banked with the distribution companies, the business proposition for the consumer or prosumer is attractive. However, the simple looking model is somewhat, in reality, it's somewhat complicated. It is well documented that distribution companies have not been particularly enthusiastic about solar rooftop. There are issues of revenue loss and issues of quality, and these concerns cannot be simply overlooked. When we look at the international experience, Germany, Spain, the USA, they have followed high penetration trajectories, and they have different models, different regulatory models, different business models which they have used. In the Indian context, there is the larger issues that arise in integrating renewable power with the grid, and this includes the fact that distribution companies must pay the fixed charges that arise from power purchase agreement for thermal power. These issues of integration will gain salience as the size of the solar rooftop capacity increases. There are other issues as well that need to be addressed. For example, for small and medium enterprises wanting to install solar rooftop, credit is often difficult. And I recently read a report which pointed out to the lack of standardization as one of the impediments in the availability of credit. So this is another area which needs to be looked at. On the flip side, solar rooftop installation offers several advantages, and this is also quite well known. Savings in network losses and distribution and transmission infrastructure costs, ease of development, easier RPO compliance, and so on. So in this situation of costs and benefits, I think the regulatory framework and the business model that is adopted should strike a balance to benefit all sides. There is a view that the views and interests of the distribution companies have been taken into account to an extent lesser than what is needed. This is something that clearly merits attention, and in the coming days, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy will be consulting the distribution companies a little more intensely than previously. I think there is a perceptional issue also involved insofar as distribution companies are concerned, and we hope that our consultation will help in removing misconceptions also. So we have taken some steps in removing bottlenecks in the solar rooftop phase 2. The dispensation governing subsidy has been made simpler. The consumer now has to pay for only the cost net of subsidy. There is an incentive for the discoms also, depending on how much they achieve relative to the previous year. However, the cumulative achievement is only 4.4 gigawatts in solar rooftop, in Indian solar rooftop. And this is something which we should not be satisfied with, and this is something which we'll work to improve. It is encouraging that several state governments and state regulatory commissions have taken interest in solar rooftop installations. 17 state commissions have issued regulations for net metering or feed-in tariffs. A number of states have come out with solar policies. We expect more facilitating measures from states in the time to come. So let me end by touching about the role that changing technology might play. This is something that also we should keep in view. If storage costs go down steeply and solar photovoltaic costs continue to decline, what will be the impact on solar rooftop installations? So it would help if we keep in view these possibilities, so that we are actually prepared when the change of technology takes place. I thank IEA once again for organizing this workshop, and I'm sure that it will be useful for all participants. Thank you.
Many thanks, Honorable Secretary, for your very comprehensive and thorough point, and also not avoiding, let's say, frank points of discussion. I don't want to summarize, but I want just to pick one thing you said. Striving for balance, trying to find a balance. I think this will be a recurring theme of the whole workshop. Thank you very much again. I would like to give the floor to the Acting Deputy Executive Director of the IEA, Mr. Dave Turk. Dave, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paolo. And let me thank the Honorable Secretary Chaturvedi for his inspiring remarks to start off this terrific workshop. And I can't frankly think of a more interesting, dynamic, and important job, Mr. Secretary, that you have, not only in India, given the challenging, as you referenced, the very challenging and impressive goals that you all are striving for, but also in the world. And so whatever we can do from the IEA to support you and your excellent team that are at MNRE, just let us know. But thank you again for your terrific partnership and remarks. Let me also thank Arunabha and all of your colleagues at CEW. It's always a pleasure to do events and analysis and efforts with you. It's a top-notch organization, and we very much value the partnership with CEW as well. So thank you for all of that. Distinguished partners from MNRE, CEW, panelists, participants, speakers, as Paolo said, from continents all over the world, literally, welcome to this terrific workshop. Let me just start by emphasizing how important the relationship with India is for the IEA. We've had a long-standing relationship working on key issues of priority for the Indian government and the Indian people for literally decades. In 2017, we had a historic milestone where we welcomed India into the IEA family more formally as an association partner. We're now discussing, literally right now and this week in our governing board, elevating the relationship to a strategic partnership, which could offer a potential pathway to eventual IEA membership for India as well. And we cooperate together not only with MNRE and other government ministries, but very important with key organizations like CEW on a whole range of issues, not only renewables, but efficiency, clean energy finance, electric vehicles, data and statistics, innovation as well. So the breadth and depth of the partnership is something that we very much value from the IEA side. We're a data-driven organization, so let me offer one data point in particular, just in terms of the importance of India for the IEA. When we look at where our web traffic is, who's exploring the IEA website from all over the world, India is now the third largest country in terms of the number of web hits. So we hope that there's value from our reports, our analysis, that our Indian colleagues, whether government, civil sector, or private sector, are receiving from our analysis. But that's just a data point to leave you all with. One of the highlights for us at the IEA of all of our efforts in 2019 was India's 2020 energy policy review that we conducted with a whole range of partners. Rightfully so, that 2019 energy policy review praised India's impressive achievements, and the Secretary laid out some of those achievements in his opening comments. It also underlined, just as the Secretary did, the urgency of continuing the work, not resting on the laurels of the progress that have been had so far, not only on energy security, but also accelerating the clean energy transition, incredible clean energy transition going on in India right now. Especially important in the Indian context is Indian demand for energy set to double by 2040. So a lot more energy coming on, and hopefully energy that has the benefits of sustainability, health impacts being lowered, et cetera, et cetera. Renewables, of course, absolutely critical role in India's clean energy transitions, even more so in the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our recent assessment looking at impacts of the global energy sector really underscore the incredible, impressive resilience of renewables, particularly in the power sector. Let me just give you a few numbers on that front. While we expect global electricity demand to decline 2% around the world this year in 2020, solar PV electricity generation is expected to increase 25%. So overall energy demand down 2%, while overall solar PV electricity generation around the world increasing 25%. Now, this is due both to the record level of new installations from last year, but also continuous deployment in 2020, despite the pandemic and the lockdown challenges around the world. Moreover, our analysis shows huge opportunities at solar PV, and particularly, and let me underscore this for this particular conference, particularly rooftop applications can bring in terms of economic recovery and job creation, political imperatives that India, all countries around the world face right now. For each $1 million of capital spending, rooftop solar PV creates around 10 local construction jobs and 6 manufacturing jobs, 16 jobs total for every million of US dollars invested. Local job creation connected to the building sector is 3 times higher than for utility scale PV, and much, much higher than other energy technologies. So a huge opportunity, especially in this time of trying to build back around the world, the jobs, the economic imperative. While fostering distributed PV brings great opportunities, we know, of course, it brings challenges. Millions of rooftop PV installations unavoidably have impacts on distribution networks and the way they're operated. The rapid expansion of this distributed PV requires close cooperation. And again, Mr. Secretary, I think you highlighted this incredibly well. Cooperation among policymakers, regulators, discoms, consumers, investors, and financial institutions as well. tariff reforms, other well-considered policies needed to attract the investment in distributed PV, securing enough revenues to pay for the maintenance and deployment and development of fixed network assets, ensuring the cost burden is allocated fairly among consumers, and warranting cost-effective system integration and electricity secure at all times. And this is something that we spend a lot of time at the IEA, and again, very eager to partner even further with the government of India and other key actors. This workshop brings an incredible talent and experience together from India and all around the world, creating an opportunity, we hope, to learn from each other, to share best policy and regulation practices in the area specifically of distributed PV. So Honorable Secretary Chaturvedi, Dr. Ghosh, many thanks for all the partnership with this workshop. Many thanks, even more importantly, for all the partnership with our excellent substantive work from the IEA, your insightful introductions, the context. All of us at the IEA look very forward to this rich and fruitful discussion. So Paulo, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dave, for affirming the strategic importance of working with India, including on this important point of solar rooftops. Now, my honor and pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, good friend and estimated colleague. Arunabha, the floor is yours. Thank you. We cannot hear you yet. Amy, can you check whether he's muted centrally?
I think someone else was controlling the mute button. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you, Paulo, and thank you very much to IEA for partnering with us on this very important dialogue. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to Secretary Chaturvedi. Good afternoon to David Turk, and of course to my friend Paulo Frankel and all the colleagues at the IEA. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to both MNRE and to IEA for taking on this issue front and center. At CEW, having completed 10 years as an institution, we are privileged to have partnered with MNRE on a range of issues for the last 10 years, starting with the very first evaluation of the National Solar Mission, working towards the upgrading and increasing of RE targets, and many other issues that we continue to work on literally on a day-to-day basis. Our partnership with the IEA is also now about 5 years old, and again, as Dave mentioned, extends beyond renewable energy, looking at investment trends, energy efficiency, green hydrogen, and many other emerging areas. But why is this issue of solar rooftops so important? Not just because in the past it made sense to have a large component of solar rooftop as part of India's large, ambitious targets for renewables, but it makes even more sense now for the post-pandemic world that we are all entering, but are still trying to find sort of compasses that can help us navigate. So let me just offer 3 thoughts about the present, about the past, and about the future. The present itself is actually quite exciting in terms of what has been achieved. Our rooftop capacity in India has increased over the past 5 years by 18 times. That, of course, has been from a low base, and as the Honorable Secretary mentioned, it's still in that 4 to 5 gigawatt range and could be significantly higher. At the same time, there have been policies that have been introduced to spur the growth of this sector, especially the phase 2 policies that the Secretary was mentioning, as well as the incentives that are being given to distribution companies. This present of what we've achieved thus far is an interesting inflection point. The reason is we have to now ask the question, and I hope that during the course of today's discussion, the panelists in the subsequent sessions will ask this question: does our present achievement on solar rooftop serve as an opportunity to bridge the past and the future. Let me explain how. What do I mean by the past? The past is the legacy power system that we have. India is one of the world's largest generators of electricity. It has a huge utility scale capacity, both using thermal power as well as renewables, as well as large hydro and nuclear. And of course, as we all know, there are significant challenges, especially at the distribution end, with the status of the distribution companies. So we can't move forward, or we can't appreciate what we have achieved in the present without paying attention to what that means for the legacy power system. And that is why it is extremely encouraging as to what the Honorable Secretary was mentioning in terms of the outreach to distribution companies to see what their concerns are. And again, there are some real concerns and there might be some perceived concerns, which is why over the past few years, we at CEW have been working closely with distribution companies in Delhi, but also in other states, to find and develop distribution company-led business models for expanding the role of rooftop solar penetration, whether it is for very poor consumers or for middle-class consumers or for all. And you will hear perhaps a bit about this in detail later in the session. So there are ways, despite those perceptions, to find a way to bridge the present with the past. But it is the future that is really promising. And that is where Dave's comments also come in, because it's the entirety of how the electricity system evolves that gives us a reason to pause and reflect and think, where does rooftop solar fit in? Firstly, coming into this post-pandemic era, we need to examine every policy through the lens of whether it creates jobs, whether it brings in new investment and growth, and of course, whether it is sustainable. And it is in that vein that the role of rooftop solar becomes so much more important. The fact that even compared to utility scale solar, our estimations are for every megawatt hour rooftop solar creates 7 times more jobs, the employment coefficient. And if we prioritize renewable energy, distributed renewable energy technologies, such as rooftop solar, but also others, they could have a 25 times more employment impact per installed capacity than conventional power sources. So bringing the job story front and center is critical. But will it also drive growth? And our belief is yes, because the distributed nature of distributed energy actually helps to spread the growth and investment rather than have it concentrated in a few places, and brings in a lot more actors in the broader ancillary chain. In fact, women have a much higher share of participation in the distributed or rooftop solar space than in conventional energy. But there are also many other aspects of energy security, especially from the point of view of the stability of the grid. We are all still perhaps examining what exactly went wrong in Maharashtra today. But again, the focus on distributed energy and rooftop systems becomes important, not just as an afterthought, but as central to how we imagine the future of the electricity system. And that then helps us to plug into the transition happening in sustainable mobility through electric vehicles, the transition happening towards energy storage, and asking ourselves the question, is it more efficient or more cost effective to focus on smaller storage systems at the consumer end, or focus on the very high capital intensive storage systems at the generation end for utility scale systems? This then helps us think about the power markets and time of day pricing. And this also helps us think about issues that the IEA has taken a leadership on, digitization of the energy system, and what India has taken a leadership on, financial inclusion. So can distributed systems help bring in the digitization, distributed storage, and also have a different kind of financial models that brings in the broader citizenry in as co-owners and co-drivers of this energy transition? It is for these reasons that I say that the present, as exciting and honorable as it is in terms of our achievements, must attempt to both look back and serve as a bridge to the past, but also take us forward into a very different energy system for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arunabha, for spelling out this vision for the future based on the bridge from the past. And I really appreciate your focus on jobs and on gender issues related to distributed energy. I would like to thank once again all the three speakers of the introductory session for setting a very, very high level tone of discussion. And without any further delay, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Kanika Chawla as the moderator of session 1. I'm sure the tone of the discussion will remain at these top heights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo, and thank you to all the speakers of the first session for really, I think, setting a very positive and invigorating message and really cutting the task out for us to sort of kind of lay out, I think, the steps of what we've already got right, but also what we can learn from other parts of the world in the following 2 sessions to realize some of the ambitions that Secretary Chaturvedi sort of set up for us right at the start, but also some of the important trade-offs that have been outlined by David as well as by Arunabha. So the session that we have now is called How to Unlock Economic Potential of the Distributed PV Sector in India. This is an important setup. The way this sort of session has been described, I think, is an important setup because for far too long, we've kind of focused on making the economics of utility scale renewable energy in India compelling. And as we all know, that they are, in fact, now the most compelling at the margin, at least, of all fuel types. But there are other benefits that in the distributed PV space far outweigh the utility scale renewables and others, and Arunabha mentioned some of these in his comments. But also for distributed PV to be adopted at scale, just like for everything else in India to be adopted at scale, the economics has to be compelling, and it cannot be based or driven just on ideology or political support or incentives alone. So we actually have with us an extremely illustrious panel today. Most of you have seen who all are on that panel, which is why you've joined us. So we're going to actually have now 6 speakers. I'll introduce them all one by one, but I also wanted to do a little housekeeping announcements. We're trying to pack in a lot in today's workshop, so we have only 1 hour for this session, and then we move into the next session, which is more of the international experiences and learning from them. In order to keep the discussion quite interactive and engaging, I'd request all of you to please use the question box on your GoToWebinar screen to send in questions for the speakers. Because we have so much ground to cover, we will be quite strictly enforcing the 5-minute per presenter rule. Unfortunately, the job of doing that enforcement is mine, so I hope the speakers will not be offended if I do have to intervene at the 5-minute mark. We will also have a timer, so speakers can kind of, pace themselves according to that, and that will give us enough time for question and answers as well as, for engagement and some clarificatory questions afterwards. What I will do just in the interest of time is do very quick introductions of each speaker and then request them to please turn on their audio and video and make their presentation. And then at the end of all speakers, if everyone could keep their videos on, and then we can have a more engaging session. So we will start with Amitesh Kumar Sinha, who a lot of you obviously know really well. He is the Joint Secretary at the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, and his portfolio includes rooftop solar, the Prime Minister's Kusum scheme, off-grid solar PV, solar manufacturing, and guidelines and standard bidding documents, as well as canal top solar scheme and renewable energy industry promotion and facilitation, among others. He is basically, as you can tell, kind of the one-stop shop for all things solar in the central government of India, which is really a very, very important task to have. So, Mr. Sinha, no, we don't envy the lots of things that you have to work on, but we are very grateful to you today for taking the time to make this presentation as well as spend the remaining afternoon with us. So with that, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Kanika. Good afternoon, Mr. Paulo, Secretary MNRE, and other distinguished participants. Because of time, I will try to hurry up. India is promoting rooftop since 2014 in a big way. Initially, we offered subsidies for all sectors, and now we are running rooftop phase 2 program, which was implemented in 2019. So we have already 1 year, and the target in rooftop segment is 40 gigawatt, which we have to fulfill by December 2022. So as Secretary Amenary has mentioned, we have roughly achieved 10% target. Next, and we are now trying to promote rooftop in a big way. So we have subsidy of 40% for residential segment up to 3 kilowatt. We have subsidy of 20% beyond that, and then we are also providing 20% subsidy to group housing scheme or RWA up to 500 kilowatt capacity. We are trying to incentivize discoms. Why? Because subsidy is limited to residential, and for other segments, if discoms are able to formulate positive policies, then they will able to install rooftop more in comparison to last year. And if capacity exceeds by 10% or 15%, they will be getting incentives in the form of 5% of the cost of additional capacity and 10% of the cost of additional capacity, respectively. Next. We have already allocated 516 megawatt and 317 megawatt capacity to different states in 2019 and 1920 and 2021. And so far, 364 megawatt in residential sector has been reported by different states. So the progress is slow. I admit that in comparison of 40 gigawatt target, this is not happening at a faster pace, but we are taking sufficient measures to try to accelerate the growth of rooftop segment. Next. We are promoting a concept of solar city. So Honorable Prime Minister has decided that one solar city in each state will be developed, and in that 100% of the households, all kind of rooftops will be covered by solar rooftop plants, and the residual energy needs can be met by installing ground mounted solar plants. And in between, we have 4 other schemes which will be converged apart from rooftop phase 2. There is a waste to energy plant which will facilitate urban local bodies to have such kind of plant. Then we have off-grid for solar lights, and then solar park scheme for installing small solar plants to meet balanced energy needs of city. Next. There are many untapped sector where rooftop growth is seen. So MSME cluster is a very important, where we are trying to work out with MSME ministry, and in that process we are also working with some multilateral financing agencies. In government buildings, we had earlier issued directive that all government buildings should be covered by rooftop. So a lot of work is there, and we have engaged different technical assistance agency or multilateral and bilateral agencies. They are working on that. There are a vast scope of rooftop space available on Awas Yojana, newly constructed houses. So there is scope. Then DISCOM can go for rooftop installation wherever network upgrade is required or transformer replacement is required, or wherever they are supplying power to low or moderate income houses where a lot of subsidies are involved. Next, please. From regulation point of view, there is RPO regulation which covers rooftop also. Net metering is available for all residential segment. Gross metering tariff is not very attractive. That's why others are not coming in rooftop segment. Discoms don't want to lose high tariff paying customer. That's why Secretary Amenary also said that there is a issue of fine balancing, and they're also reluctant to allow behind the meter or open access connection. Next, please. We have some suggestions for regulators. A separate target for rooftop may be fixed, and then MERC in Maharashtra has come up with a very good regulation. So I recommend that other regulators can also consider that. And then if we are going for gross metering, then generous FIT or average cost of purchase plus T&D losses may be taken as a criteria to fix such kind of tariff. And then open access and behind the meter should be allowed. Next, please. We have various business models with which other speakers will speak like consumer discom-led models, where consumer-owned models is there, where discoms aggregate, and discom-owned models where discom aggregates and act as a resco player. Then we have discom as a super resco player, which acts as a trader between resco and consumer. Then we have on-bill financing, where utility raises cheaper debt for consumers. We have payment assurance model, where discom collects electricity charges for a fee for private developers. Then we have virtual net metering, where energy exported to the grid and adjustment in more than one electricity service connection is provided. Then we have group net metering, and then the recent concept in Western world regarding community virtual power plant. I am very hopeful that if cost of battery will further reduce, this concept will also be popular in India. Next, please. The impact of COVID is seen everywhere. So we have seen muted demand from other than government sector. Difficulty in accessing residential customer premises is the main complaint we are receiving from rooftop developers. Commercial industrial customers are not taking decision because of shortage of funds with them. In COVID pandemic, we have installed 85 megawatt RTS in Q2 of 2020, which is 56% less in comparison of Q1 and 71% less in comparison to Q2 of 2019. By and large, finance is not a major issue. However, rooftop vendors face difficulty in continuing their business because rooftop involves 24-25 jobs per megawatt. So certainly, we are also seeing a slow progress in job creation. Next, please. Thank you.
Oh, very good, sir. You were absolutely on time. I was just going to come in, but you saved me that. But also, thank you very much for covering so much ground. And clearly, you know, there is a comprehensive rooftop support policy that's already in place. With that, we're actually going to turn to hear from my colleague, Neeraj Kuldeep, who is a program lead at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And he's been working with state discoms on creating innovative market frameworks and business models to deepen the market. And that actually builds very nicely on a lot of the comments that Mr. Sinha just made, because it was about what all schemes are already there, but how can those be leveraged further to kind of create a more robust ecosystem. And Neeraj will talk to us a little bit about that. So Neeraj, over to you.
Hi, Kanika. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Kanika, and good afternoon, everyone. So in my presentation, I will briefly capture the interventions that we need to really scale up the rooftop solar deployment in India. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So the Council on Energy, Environment and Water is one of South Asia's leading not-for-profit policy research institutions. The Council uses data integrated analysis and strategic outreach to explain and change the use, reuse and misuse of resources. I'm representing the renewable energy team here. And as Kanika mentioned in the introduction, we closely work with state discoms, nodal agencies, regulators, and central government to support innovation, bridge knowledge gap, and build new tools and framework for accelerated rooftop solar deployment. This is, of course, in addition to the plethora of work we do on advancing India's RE ambitions. Next slide, please. So from JS Sinha, we just learned that India has set an ambitious target of achieving 40 gigawatt of rooftop solar capacity by 2022. We are still a little far away from achieving this, but on a positive side, it is because of this mammoth target that we are witnessing an exponential growth in the sector, except for last few months, which has witnessed a slow growth due to the pandemic. If we look at the progress made in the sector so far, it is because of the collective efforts put in by the government, the industry, and of course the consumers on the four key aspects. This includes the foundational aspects on the favorable policy and the regulatory ecosystem, and creating incentive structures in the form of capital subsidy, additional subsidies by states, generation-based incentives, to increase the economic viability for consumers, and then increase consumer awareness for the organic growth in the sector. And lastly, we must acknowledge the contribution of industry players for bringing innovation to address challenges faced by the consumer in the sector. However, going forward, for the next phase of the growth, India would have to focus on equitable sharing of cost and benefit of rooftop solar between a consumer, a DISCOM, and a solar vendor. Also, new business models addressing persistent market challenges would be instrumental in supporting the exponential growth. Next slide, please. Let's first talk about why the equitable sharing of cost and benefit of rooftop solar is important. In most Indian states, we are following either net metering or gross metering or combination of both these two metering policies. Both these mechanisms either favor the consumers or the DISCOMs. In case of net metering, it favors the consumers and DISCOMs are making losses on their revenue collection. On the other hand, if we see gross metering, it adversely impacts the economic viability of the system for the consumers and the RESCO players because DISCOMs are compensating solar generation at their average power procurement cost, which is far lesser than the grid tariff. So considering these challenges, we at CEW have developed a new framework called Valuing Grid Connected Rooftop Solar, VGRS, which accounts for various benefits and cost parameter to calculate net benefit or cost for a DISCOM. We did a study with BSES Rajdhani DISCOM in Delhi with a mix of 10 distribution transformers from residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional consumer categories. And we realized that even after accounting for revenue loss, DISCOMs are making an additional benefit of rupees 22 for it's rupees 0.22 for every unit of solar energy being generated in their network. Such framework will allow us to move to a more equitable regime and would ensure support from the DISCOM, which has been the challenge in the sector. Next slide, please. Again, like we discussed in the previous presentation and in the beginning, the sector has made significant progress over last many years, but there are still many challenges that limits the adoption of rooftop solar in certain segments. Many of them still do not have access to suitable rooftops, cheaper finance, access to right vendors who provide quality systems, and the DISCOM processes on net metering. To address some of these challenges, we would need new business models, and CW has been testing some of these business models with utilities and states in few geographies. For example, community solar allows consumer in multi-story buildings with shared rooftop to own a share of a larger system. On-bill finance, on the other hand, helps consumer who see upfront cost as a major barrier. The third business model, solar partners, it utilizes excess roof spaces from commercial and industrial buildings to provide solar electricity on annual subscription basis to all consumers, including people who live in rented properties. Similarly, the last business model, rural community feeder model, provides access to rooftop solar to rural consumers who receive subsidized electricity and reduces the burden on the DISCOMs. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's the last slide, and more information on these business models can be seen on CW website across many reports that we have put out. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Neeraj, for that very interesting and innovative ideas filled presentation. And I think that it's important to also for us we often think about innovation mostly in the technology context, and your presentation made it quite clear that there is need for innovation also in market design as well as in business models for us to really accelerate the pace at which rooftop solar is added. We're now going to kind of have a slight shift in pace in the presentations where we are going to learn from the lived experiences of states as well as of practitioners on the ground. And before we do that, I wanted to once again call on all the participants to please use the question and chat box to send in any questions that you may have for the speakers. Without wasting any more time and sort of really diving right into hearing from those who have witnessed firsthand what it means to deploy solar rooftop at scale, I'd like to turn to Mr. Manu Srivastav, who was formerly the Principal Secretary of New and Renewable Energy in the government of Madhya Pradesh, as well as the Managing Director of the Madhya Pradesh Urja Vikas Nigam Limited. He was spearheading the task of energizing the state with renewable energy and really making Madhya Pradesh the poster child of innovation in market design for renewable energy in India. Presently, he is the administrative member of the Board of Revenue of the government of Madhya Pradesh, but continues to be a champion for renewable energy, not just in India, but in emerging economies around the world. So, Mr. Srivastav, we'll hand over to you. Just let us know when you want to use your slides.
Thanks, Kanika, for the introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So, yes, we have had good experience of setting up rooftop renewable projects in the state. And we realized at the beginning of the entire exercise that most beneficiaries are not willing to have put in any capital resources for setting up solar rooftop. So we went in for a RESCO mode. And then we realized that somehow the developers of rooftop are not taken as seriously as the developers for ground-mounted projects. So, for example, for ground-mounted projects, we have detailed standard bidding guidelines and so on, which, well, of course, came in 2017, but they did. But rooftop is not given doesn't have standard bidding guidelines, for example. So we worked a lot on the tender conditions to reduce the risks and uncertainties of the rooftop developers. And because of this process, we got phenomenally good rates. The lowermost rate that we got was power at 1 rupee 38 paisa per unit. Of course, it was with the Government of India subsidy and also the subsidy of Government of Madhya Pradesh. But even if you remove that subsidy, the rate of 1 rupee 38 would translate, if you remove all subsidies, would translate to a rate of 2 rupee 21 paisa, which is good even for a ground-mounted project. So I'll just talk very briefly about the features in our tender which allowed the developers to have such low rates. So one of the first feature was, could I have the slide please, was we created the market. Otherwise the pattern in India has been that we leave it to the rooftop developers, next please, to go and look and convince engineering colleges and medical, next slide please, and engineering colleges and so on. Just go back to the last one please. Yeah, so we created a market. We ourselves convinced the colleges in the state, for example. So if you look at the first row, it has 291 government colleges. So we convinced all the 291 government colleges in the state, not just in the state capital or division headquarters, but in all district headquarters, down to Tehsil headquarters. So there was one tender which covered only the government colleges. It helped the bidder because the sizes of rooftop systems in various government colleges were roughly in the same range. Then the next, for example, is government medical colleges. We convinced all the government medical colleges. So you notice the difference here. While the average size of project for a normal college was less than 20 kilowatt, that for a government medical college is more than 1 megawatt. So obviously we got much lower rates for the government medical college than we did for the government colleges. But the developer had certainty as to what he is going in for. And next slide, please. And then we facilitated the developers to have efficient signing of PPAs. So the photograph that you see, we invited all the college principals to Bhopal in a meeting, and all of them signed PPAs on one day. So what would have, next slide please, what would have taken 6 months for the developer to do, we did similarly for others as well. What would have taken 6 months, a year for the developer to do, happened in one day. Next slide please. The other innovation that we did in the tender was that we created a data room for each tender. For example, the tender for government colleges had one data room. In that data room, there was a subfolder for each college. And each subfolder had each one of these details which are there in the slide before you. The Google coordinate of that building. We had an indicative solar PV array, which is superimposed on the Google image. So it's some sort of a pre-engineering design. We gave the electricity bill. We gave the inverter positioning. We even gave the length of the cable. Could I have the next slide? That's just an illustration of what it was. So this is an example of what it had. This is for one particular college. So there was a Google map. It had that much detail that there is a tree adjacent to the building, and the shadow of the tree falls on a certain part of the building. So we had an indicative solar PV layout in which no solar PV arrow is supposed to be put in the shadow of the tree. If you go to the bottom or left hand side, it even mentions how many inverters you need, how much strings you need, and how much modules you need. So sitting in his office in Bangalore or Delhi or Noida or wherever, the developer knew that for this particular college, they needed 4 inverters, 247 modules, and 817.8 meters of copper. So because of this, the pre-engineering design and the information that we gave to the bidders, we reduced the information asymmetry, and then we a lot of other features. Next slide, please. Which I would not have the time to go into, but we had a number of other features which were developed in discussion with the developers, which gave us 7 or 8 times as much participation as the tender size, and we got phenomenally low rates. The lowest rate was 1 rupee 38 paise, which, as I mentioned, was with subsidy, but if you remove subsidy also, it's around 2 rupee 2 rupee 21 paisa, which I think is very good even for a ground mounted project. So for rooftop, it's very good. Thanks, Kanika. I'm sorry, exceeded by a few seconds, but I think after the Trump-Biden debate, you will apologize me for these small transgressions.
Go ahead, sir.
That's it.
Okay,
yeah,
great. So also, I'd like to again make a quick request to the panelists that if you will give your consent, we will be sharing these presentations with everyone who has signed up for this webinar. So you can actually go into much more of the detail at that time, and then we can connect you to the speakers if you have any clarificatory questions. But also, again, feel free to use the chat function to ask those questions. Also, Mr. Srivastav, always very inspiring to hear about the innovation, and as a policy and research institution for us at CEW, the idea of data rooms and making all of this available upfront, of course, is just it's a dream come true. And I think that if more of this was done, of course, there would nothing could stop the realizing of rooftop solar at scale across the country. We'll also now turn to a different example and hear from Mr. Abhishek Ranjan. If you could just put on your video, Abhishek, if you can hear me. So Abhishek Ranjan is the additional vice president of system operations, power markets, as well as the head of the renewable energy and demand side management and energy efficiency and energy analytics department at BRPL, and he has been instrumental in many innovative approaches that BRPL is taking to support rooftop solar. And the importance of this kind of support for rooftop solar from within and electricity utility cannot be overstated enough, especially because conventionally electricity utilities are seen to be opposing the transition towards rooftop solar, whereas BRPL is actually really leading the charge towards the adoption and really supporting the adoption of rooftop solar in their service area. And we're very honored to be working very closely with Abhishek and the BRPL team in supporting their transition. Abhishek, can you hear me? Okay, so I think that there's a little bit of trouble. We will sort that out, but maybe in the meantime, we'll hear from a practitioner and then come back to Abhishek since we're having a little bit of technical trouble. So with that, actually, I think in a way it's quite a nice segue as well, because Mr. Srivastav talked so much about making the process of or making the life of developers basically easier in the solar rooftop context, and the role that different policy, regulatory, as well as data-based interventions can make. And now we'll turn actually to a practitioner. So maybe we can turn to Kushagra. So Kushagra Nandan is the co-founder and president of SunSource Energy. and one of India's leading integrated distributed solar companies. And he has been instrumental in shaping the company's strategy and leading its project execution, technology, and engineering efforts to carve a niche in the global solar market. Kushagra is also a longtime friend of CEW, so we're always very happy to host him. And so Kushagra, maybe when you're making your presentation, we want to, of course, hear about, how lucrative it is to be in the solar PV business and inspire others to also join this business and give you competition, but also to talk about, the importance of some of the interventions that we heard about from Mr. Srivastava and how they can act as kind of incentives and levers, and that incentives need not always be financial.
Sure. Can you hear me all right, Kanika?
Yeah.
Great. I think thank you, and wonderful panel you have. So I think one thing is very clear, that if we have policy makers like Mr. Srivastava, Mr. Sinha, it makes a lot of easy for the developers, and it helps scale up the deployment of solar rooftop in this country. So I think we need more leaders like them in the country. So I think we can go to the next slide. So we, as SunSource, we are a solar project developer which focus mostly on commercial industrial rooftops, and not only across India, but we also focus in Southeast Asia and few other countries. And in India, we have developed projects and own assets across 24 states. We are also an investee company of NEEV Fund, which is a joint fund of State Bank of India and UK government. So we can go to the next slide. So the big question is rooftop PV profitable? It is profitable, but if it's done right, and if we have a lot of data rooms, if we have a lot of data, which we do, so it helps us save money on the upfront business development work. It makes projects happen much faster, and it makes price competitive, and it makes companies also competitive and makes them profitable as well. And we see CNI, commercial industrial, is a more profitable segment at this point of time because how the tariffs are structured in the country. The other thing is from a DISCOM perspective, because rooftop PV helps in reducing the transmission and distribution losses, it makes a lot of sense for DISCOMs to adopt solar PV. And customers can help become more prosumers, and with net metering, they have more and more option. We can go to the next slide, please. So because the T&D losses in the country are much higher, so it's making a lot of sense to start deploying solar at the distributed level, and be it the open access, be it at on-site, and majorly on-site, be it residential, also in a lot of states has started to make sense, and there are a lot of benefits to the DISCOMs. It avoids a generation cost, and what we are seeing is it also helps in reducing the working capital requirement of the DISCOMs. The RECs and distribution capacity costs are also can be managed, and the benefit to consumers are multifold, including they get a lower lower tariff than what they are paying to the DISCOM, and high reliability, quality power, and with the storage starting to emerge as a dominant option, solar plus storage also starts to become a lot of starts making sense in multiple of states in the country. Next slide, please. So, scaling up investment in distributed PV technology. So what can be done is, in order to scale solar, each DISCOM can have a single nodal person who can be responsible for promoting the rooftop or ensuring the regulatory framework is followed or net metering is done right. And I think a few DISCOMs are doing that, including BSES and Delhi DISCOMs are very, very proactive in that case, and that is helping to deploy solar in Delhi. I think a lot of DISCOMs can follow up that model. Plus easy financing options and platforms. For example, the SBI World Bank line and KFW line, they're also helping to scale up the solar. the clarity and the clarity on the regulatory front also becomes very, very important. The other thing which is starting to happen is this Kusum Yojana, although it has not kicked off yet, but with the lowering of the prices on the solar panels, and hopefully we are able to structure from a financial perspective on the Kusum front these smaller projects, 1 megawatt type projects at the agricultural feeder. So that will actually help serve the DISCOM, because that will help reduce the losses at the agricultural feeder perspective. So there are more than 6 lakh villages in the country, and if we are able to structure solar projects in these agricultural feeder side, that will help increase the GDP, because ultimately that's a direct impact to these 6 lakh villages. We can go to the next slide. And what is lacking is if we can, although because electricity is still a state subject, so a lot of if the clarity is there, so which can give a long-term visibility, bring in a lot of investors, and if we have leaders who promote solar, and which is very, very important, so that it reduces the overall cost. And what is also happening is with the storage coming in, government has already identified the areas where storage solutions should be deployed in the phase 1, which we are seeing, and that the cost is reduced tremendously in that case. So that is helping more and more deployment in this case. We can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you. You were absolutely on time. Thank you very much for that, Kushagra, and also for all the exciting things that you're doing in this sector. And I think that very clearly, I think that you're responding very much to the innovation that is happening also on the policy, regulatory, and financial side, which actually also in a way, I think, helps us to kind of go back now to Abhishek, who I had just introduced a moment ago, to talk about how, where there is so much interest in supporting rooftop solar at the policy level. We heard right from the secretary as well as from the joint secretary. Then there is innovation happening by state governments. There is a very enthusiastic, industry movement which wants to do much more in the rooftop solar space. But usually DISCOMs are thought of as, the bottleneck. Whereas you and BRPL in specific is actually, as Kushagra also said, being very innovative and very proactive. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about, why that is, why you see rooftop solar as an opportunity, and what it is that BRPL is doing to advance rooftop solar in its service area. Over to you.
Thank you, Kanika. Am I audible, please?
Yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Thank you. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is a very brief about what we do and where we operate. The green color in the top, the bottom part, I mean, west and south of the Delhi, 750 square kilometers, the largest utility in the city of Delhi. Next slide, please. So this has been a journey so far. This is as of YTM August 2020, but then by 30th September, we had crossed 70 megawatt. Delhi as a whole is about 170 megawatt, and over 2,300 net metered connections. Mostly it is residential in terms of numbers, but the capacity comes from institutional sector, which is having a share of more than 40%. Where the residential is number terms, it is 50%, but the capacity is 20%. So growth is there in the fragmented residential sector, and that is why our program is focused there. The rooftop solar potential in Delhi varies from 1.5 to 2 gigawatt, whereas in our license area, we see it as 500 megawatt, which is, if you see the peak load that we met last year was 3.2 gigawatts. It is sizable capacity, and it has a very strong potential to help shape our net demand. Next slide, please. These are some of the DISCOM's perspective. What Kanika, you were asking me, why are we so gung-ho and we are supportive of the distributed energy resource, which is rooftop solar. We see our future in rooftop solar because distributed energy resource is the way for us to transform to DSO. What are the benefits? Some of the obvious benefits are in terms of the network optimization, the left-hand side of my table. network upgrade, capex deferral in terms of providing more delight to the customer, in terms of reducing their bill. RPO is anyway there. Reactive power and voltage control. This is another network optimization feature which is available through volt-var and volt-watt characteristic. So it will be a part of our DERMS, basically, the solar rooftop. We are not looking at solar rooftop from that perspective. That is the challenge. Challenge here is integration with the grid. So the technical capability and preparedness has to be there, which we did. I mean, 2 years back. We are now very sure that yes, up to this limit, this is not a problem. Payment security, lack of trust. These were some of the problems in the existing business model. We talk about solarization of the congested roofs in the congested network. I mean, introduction of the battery storage, as Kushagra was also talking about. We are doing some pilot with solar PV port and store with GIZ, which is supposed to help us in managing the entire network. Synchronizing with the electric vehicle charging is another opportunity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are some of the initiatives that we have already taken, but I will talk about what we need to take and we are taking now in future. The yellow color bar over here, which you see here, utility facilitated hybrid model to tap the smaller roof size rooftop solar in residential sector. That is the way to go. Next slide. So the two net metering models which have already been introduced by the regulator are GNM, which you see on the slide over here, which is to proliferate across a single consumer having multiple premises or multiple meter connections. He can proliferate in that way. This is the way to promote rooftop solar. The second one, next slide, please. This is virtual net metering where somebody doesn't have a roof, but still she can enjoy the fruits of rooftop solar. So these two are already there under the regulation. What we are talking about is in the next slide. In the next slide one. This is what we are talking about, where utility anchored rooftop solar model, wherein the DISCOM completely buys out each and every part of the power in terms of gross metering, whereas the net metering benefits are given to the consumer. So it's a hybrid model of gross metering and the net metering, which can work. And this may solve problems of, like, for example, payment security, or people don't have money to invest, etc., lack of low-cost loans, etc. Next slide. These are some of the key studies undertaken. I mean, I'm glad that CW and we partnered to get something called VGRS. I think they will talk about it later on, value of grid-connected rooftop solar. Next slide. This is a brief of the complete framework. We talk about what are the costs, what are the benefits, and you do the BC analysis. We did it for ourselves and we are not expanding it. We have found that there is a lot of value for rooftop solar in the residential sector, and that is where we are pushing it. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. RTS PV, I mean, the 4 points which I want to point out is these are the very good points which is there for every DISCOM to ponder and work on. Is first is this contributes to reduction in T&D losses. Now there is a need to be captured. It needs to be captured clearly in the loss evaluation framework set by the Central Electricity Authority. CEA has given a framework to evaluate ACS ARR gap as well as T&D loss input as well. Next is subsidized distribution generation can be focused on the residential segment. It can help reduce the cross subsidy in retail tariff, and that is the pain point wherein everybody is going for open access, and that is the genesis of all the points. This can usher in retail tariff reforms through reduction in cross subsidy, and thereby also limiting outflight of the C&I consumers from the DISCOMs. Everybody is worried. I mean, if C&I consumers go solar and I'm high and dry, that is not the case. DISCOMs can utilize RTS PV as a means to reduce their power purchase cost, optimize network operation cost, and expand business frontiers. I'm talking about from the point of view of energy services company. That is the future, because ultimately this is not a vicious cycle of death for a DISCOM. It's a vicious cycle of death for the upstream power generators, not for the DISCOM. So if DISCOMs changes, so the nutshell, rooftop solar is the foremost dominant of the distributed energy resources, and this is key to the DISCOM's transition to the DSO. Over to you, Kanika. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. Very, very interesting, very important to kind of show that there is, in fact, a cost and benefit equation that works in favor of rooftop solar for all parties involved. And I'm very glad that you're showing kind of the test case or the use case for other discoms as well. With that, actually, I think it's again a good point to turn to Abhinav Goyal, who's our final speaker for this session. So Abhinav Goyal is an energy consultant with the World Bank, and he is engaged in managing the flagship grid-connected rooftop solar program of World Bank in India, the one that Kushagra also mentioned, and he leads up both the investment as well as technical assistance work streams. Thank you, Abhinav, for joining us. I think that, again, Abhishek set it up very nicely for your intervention, especially where, if the counterparty does also business development for, in the industry that's going to be providing the rooftop service, it's kind of like a very happy matrimony. So is that something that, within your program is something that you are encouraging, and those are the kinds of programs that you want to, finance? And also, what are the other objectives that you're looking to realize with this very large agreement that you have? So with that, over to you, Abhinav.
Okay, thanks, Kanika, for the introduction. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I would focus my presentation on two aspects. First is the role of the development finance. And second, I would underscore the key findings of a policy white paper, which we are working with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy under the Technical Assistance Program. So although JS Amitesh has already covered it, but I will just underscore one or two key elements. So next, please. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. The role of development finance, as I mentioned, so like the rooftop solar program represents quintessential maximizing finance for development concept of MDBs. The maximizing finance for development exemplifies how the World Bank program catalyzes the market and leverages other sources of finance to have a much more significant impact from a dollar of lending or investment. So I will just take an example of rooftop solar to explain this. In 2016, there was around 500 megawatt of rooftop solar in the, since the launch of the government's program back in 2010. So at that stage, MNRE requested for this project to World Bank, and then World Bank partnered with SBI for a $640 million rooftop program. And it was the first risk taker in the market. It was the first to lend when there was no debt available. So the program has already disbursed around 70% of the bank loan and estimated $3.5 million catalyzed from other funding sources, as you could see on the slide. The other sources could be pension funds, institutional investors, or other commercial banks or development banks getting the comfort to lend to the sector. So the program has been, instrumental in increasing the debt financing availability, de-risking to mobilize commercial financial flows, and building capacities across the PV industry to significantly expand rooftop solar PV uptake across India. Next, please. Excuse me, next. Yeah, thanks. The existing World Bank SBI program overview is provided here, but I would like to underscore the fact that the bank was able to mobilize cheaper funds and grants from CIF, Climate Investment Fund, and Global Environmental Facility. This brought the concessionality to the program, thereby reducing the cost of debt. So in 2016, when the bank launched this program, the typical debt which was available was a double digits. But through the program, we were able to kind of bring the cost of debt to a single digit. So that's the kind of impact which MDB could bring to a sector. Next, please. So it's not just the loan that the World Bank Group provides, it also has other instruments, for instance, guarantees that provide credit enhancement. The benefit of such an instrument is the leveraging it gives. So on the screen, there is an example for our MSME. We are currently working on a program with Ministry of New and Renewable Energy and MSME. So we are in the conceptualization phase. So wherein we want to bring this guarantee product for the rooftop solar in the MSME sector. And the idea behind is like there could be a leveraging or a gearing which could be introduced because of this. So as you could see, it's roughly 3.5 times by the same amount of the guarantee as compared to a loan product. It has certain assumptions, and this varies based on the assumptions. So right now, this leveraging assumes a default rate of 10% and the guarantee coverage of 50%. So under the existing SBI program, MSME form a small share of the overall financing, typically because of the perceived risk. However, they have a very strong commercial case for adopting rooftop solar. The electricity costs could be as high as 20% of the operating cost, and they have high retail tariff. And like with the current levels of tariff for rooftop solar, their operational cost could be significantly reduced. And let's hope that this gets finalized soon, and then we would be able to like provide the comfort to the commercial banks and NBFCs to lend to rescos or MSME for installing rooftop solar. Thanks. So this is basically initial part. I focus more on the financing bit. Now, just to mention that it's like for mobilizing a market, the role of MDB is not restricted to financing, but it also includes sharing the knowledge and expertise, typically through technical assistance program, for creating a market. Initial in our discussion, Mr. Srivastava already covered the demand aggregation part of it. But just to also mention that there are other elements as well related to policy, regulatory, building capacities, digitalizing efforts for the rooftop solar applications, and raising the awareness through media outreach program. Next, please. So, right. So I won't go into further details into this because Amitesh ji had already covered most of the elements. But I would just like to underscore that, in general, we would suggest that it would be good to, at the first level, allow the net metering till the time the RTS state targets are met. Then the states could transition to alternate mechanism like gross metering or net feed-in. However, the critical point is related to how the tariffs are determined, or the feed-in tariff. And in that regard, either the approach which was mentioned by Amitesh ji on APPC and factoring the transmission and distribution losses could be covered, or even simply the tariff determination, the cost plus tariff determination process followed by the regulators. So if these three steps are ensured, we believe it would provide the required certainty and predictability on critical aspects of metering and energy accounting and settlement. I would just end here on a simple note that maybe, rather requesting MNRE for mobilizing concessional financing for residential consumers and MSME, because both these sectors are very critical for rooftop solar to become a mass movement and achieve the targets. Thanks a lot. I will stop.
Great, thank you very much, Abhinav. Can I request all the panelists to turn on their videos, and then we can have a quick question answer session. There's quite a few questions actually that have come in. So what I will do is I will bundle the questions rather than go one by one, just in the interest of time, so that we can answer quite a lot of them. Perhaps maybe Mr. Sinha, we'll start with you. One of the big concerns with the growing share of renewables is obviously around intermittency. And there have been quite a few questions which sort of talked about the importance of batteries in advancing rooftop solar, but also kind of the role that rooftop solar can play in addressing some of these intermittency challenges, especially because of its decentralized nature. So is that something, because I know that there's again a lot of work that's happening within MNRE and its associated agencies on designing, or at least in some way incentivizing and pricing the firm power and where balancing becomes simpler. So is this something that's also being kept in mind in the case of rooftop solar, and how exactly is that happening?
Thank you, Kanika. Since we are trying to address this grid balancing aspect in our giga scale tenders, and we have seen that we have come up with various innovative tender, and it includes picking power tender, then RTC tender, and so on. And we will continue to do so in future also. As far as rooftop is concerned, whenever the cost of battery will slightly reduce, so it will also start acting like as a firm power. I have mentioned in my presentation a particular aspect of virtual power plant. So this is happening in Western world, particularly in Germany and USA, where the rooftop developers are providing batteries along with the rooftop plants on the houses of consumers, and all these access to batteries are with RESCO players, and with the help of batteries and with the help of RTS plant, they are trying to stabilize grid. They're having agreement with grid operators, and whenever frequency disturbance is there, or whenever extra power is required, so these batteries are discharged, and roughly 1,000 to 2,000 customers are totally connected to this kind of network. So they call this virtual power plant. So in future, whenever the cost of battery will come down and good quality batteries will start manufacturing in India, this will also start happening. So I'm very sure that this issue will be addressed, and there will be no such concern as far as rooftop will be concerned.
Great. If any of the rest of you wanted to come in on that, please just maybe you can raise your hand. But also I'll move on to the next question because I think that Mr. Sinha's answered that. Okay, Abhishek, please.
Yeah, so I completely second Mr. Sinha. Only one thing is rooftop solar, or for that matter solar, is not that much of a problem for grid balancing. Wind is much of a problem, but solar is not. So even if I am sure about the roof, if you talk about the forecasting MAPE of the rooftop solar, what we are seeing is hardly 3% or 2%. That is nothing. So integrating rooftop solar is never a pain. Or for that matter, Mr. Sinha is here. Even sir, we are taking a lot of solar power utility from power through SECI. Sir, that is never a pain. The pain is in wind power, sir. So integrating rooftop solar will never be a problem. As you rightly said, VPP, yes, is the way to go. We are doing one pilot PV quote and store. You might be aware with GIZ. We are trying to popularize that, and let us see. The challenge is, as you rightly said, to bring down the cost. So over to you, Kanika.
I would further add that the net metering regulations in almost all states are so conservative that they don't really allow too much of rooftop solar to be injected, because most states allow the transformer capacity not exceeding 80% or so. The regulations by themselves really put a lid on how much rooftop solar can come into the system.
Actually, on that, there was also a follow-on question around net metering itself. And net metering is obviously very clearly a very important incentive or lever at the moment in advancing rooftop solar. But will it, in the medium to long run, act as an impediment because of the kind of burden or that it will place on utilities? And I, of course, don't think that will be the case, but I'm not the expert. So I want to hand over to one of you to answer that. So please, whoever would, maybe Kushagra, if you want to take that.
Sure. From our perspective, we will always like all the states in the country adopt net metering. And even though some states who have stopped net metering and moved towards a gross metering model, they should adopt it. But I think on the serious note, it surely helps the utility, because if you look at from a utility's balance sheet perspective, they can utilize the power which they're saving on other consumers, and so that the blackouts and brownouts can be reduced. And I'm sure there are other experts in Mr. Sinha, Mr. Srivastav, and Mr. Ranjan are here. So like to understand their views as well. Mr. Goyal is here as well.
Okay, there's a lot. So I'm also just slightly conscious of time. I do want to hear from all of you on this issue. And I'll add on one question that I want to pose to everyone, and then we'll hand over for the next session. So definitely on what do you think is the future of net metering and how critical is it to advancing rooftop solar? And the second question is, we've talked a lot in this past hour about everything that we've got right and everything that can be scaled up to have this kind of like a mass movement, as Abhinav called it. But what have we not figured out yet? So what do we want to learn from other countries? If you can just kind of almost, set the bar for the next session, is what are the things that we are looking to learn? And I'll go in the order that you appear on my screen. So we'll start with you, Abhinav. Those two questions very quickly, please.
Okay, thanks. For net metering, as we said, also it was covered, like that it's not a problem till the time forecasting errors are minimized and it is embedded in the day ahead forecasting and things like that. But obviously, like as you progress, so therefore I mentioned about a predictable policy regime where or on this metering part, so where to initially, because we are sitting at 4 or 5% of the state targets and discouraging net metering and not coming out with a feed-in tariff which is attractive enough would not, enable the rooftop solar sector to grow. So I think that's something which we need to figure out if states want to move from net to gross, but then there should be a commercially attractive tariff. So that's one. On the second point on what we could learn from other states or from other countries is rather, on a longer term. I actually remember in one of the discussions, Hemi mentioned, the price of the rooftop or solar in general would be so low that this discussion may become irrelevant. So it is better to kind of take cognizance of that and plan today, assuming that this is unstoppable. So I will just stop here. Thank you.
Abhishek?
Yeah, so what I'm saying is the net metering had never been a problem, to my mind. If you talk about what is net metering, you credit the surplus at the end of the year at the rate of APPC. What is APPC? That rate is the average power procurement cost of the DISCOM given by the regulator. So that is the equivalent cost. It's neither giving high nor giving low. So it's a kind of win-win for the, it's kind of a power procurement by the DISCOM at the rate of APPC. Now, as far as consumer is concerned, he is getting direct benefit in terms of volumetric net. So why DISCOMs in India, or why should we be worried about it? The only fear is about C&I consumers going in, and that is impacting our revenue. Why is that happening? Because of the cross subsidy. Then that's what I'm saying. Why don't we use rooftop solar to nip in bud that cross subsidy thing, so that this cross subsidy requirement comes down? Therefore, the tariff disparity can come down, retail tariff disparity, and therefore the net metering can take off. So the only problem here is the C&I consumers going the net metering way. Therefore, the state is having some problem. And the next thing is obviously, the government of India is also working on the AT&C losses. So CEA gives a very good formula for estimation of T&D loss. We had a lot of discussions with CEA and their chief engineer, and we had requested them, they have agreed also, as to how to use and utilize this solar rooftop generation to say or to prove that this is reducing the T&D loss of the district. This has to be, this is already there in the formula, it is there. If it can be, popularized and told to the states, that solar rooftop is actually helping them achieving some targets set for them by the government. So these are the two factors only. The net metering should not be a problem. And as far as California, an example, California, for example, why are they worried of the solar? Because what I learned from them is there is no fixed cost taken from the retail consumers. It's only variable cost. And that is the problem. Who pays for the grid access charges? So Maharashtra coming in with the grid access charges, which have been postponed for now, will become the norm of the day tomorrow. As of now, also the wheeling charges are exempted for the rooftop solar to promote it. That is the only worry. If the fixed costs of the discoms are met, there's no problem at all.
Got it. Thank you. Mr. Srivastava, very quickly on net metering and what you want to learn from the others.
Well, firstly, I must say that I really love Abhishek. I love everyone who's has good things to say about renewable energy. But I would say that what he said is perhaps sweeter and happier than what the truth is. That he said that net metering is nothing but purchasing power at APPC. There is another feature that discoms offer that is really banking at zero cost, because you are injecting excess power during daytime, and the customer has the freedom to draw in the evening time when very often power rates are higher. So that is another feature which is what discoms object to. So I would say that broadly you have to divide the states into two categories: those which are power excess, which would not typically welcome net metering, whichever incentive might be given to them, and those other states which are power deficit, where a customer standing on his own feet and consuming his own power really helps the discoms. So in the first category of states, it is frankly difficult for the discoms to convince them about the value of net metering. What we have tried, that we focused on government buildings. The idea was that discoms finally belong to the government. So if you say that the government is directly benefiting, that lessens the resistance of the discoms. And moreover, discom MDs, unlike Abhishek, in most of India are essentially government officials who are just doing one posting in the discom. So their final loyalty is, so to say, to the government and not really to the discom. So they would do whatever is beneficial to the government. So we have tried and worked on that. Net metering, well, yes, it continues to be a challenge. So there are two things that come to my mind. One is that the difference between solar and the discom prices is so big that perhaps we should divide the differential between the customer and the discom. And secondly, through better transaction structures, better contractual conditions of our tenders, we should try to reduce the rates of rooftop solar so that the differential becomes higher and it becomes easier to share the kitty. What we tried to do in Madhya Pradesh was the second thing. We tried to lower the rates, but the other thing that needs to be done is that the differential, if it's high, the rates are low, differential is high. If you got a power at 1 rupee 38 paisa and removing subsidy 221, at discom tariff of around 8 rupees, it gives a margin of almost 5.5 rupees, which is a lot of kitty to be shared between the discom and the consumers. So these are the two things which I think need to be tried.
I think we've answered this net metering question quite comprehensively. So, Mr. Sinha, if you want to add to it, please do, but also please say what would you like to learn from the experience of other countries, which we're going to have in the next session. And Hemi is here already, so we're almost at time.
Okay, so Kanika, I will just mention what Abhishek has said. So in India, generally the residential tariff is 36% less vis-a-vis industrial tariff. And when we see world average, it is 60, actually the residential tariff is 16% more. So clearly there is a mismatch in India, and Abhishek was talking about cross subsidy and other charges. So ultimately it has to go. And in electricity amendment bill also, this reduction of cross subsidy and other charges have been prescribed. So if we try to incentivize residential consumers, and they will come up in a big way, then this kind of losses can be minimized in future. Apart from this, there are various other benefits of rooftop. As far as Government of India is concerned, we are not concerned about net metering or gross metering. As long as the payback period is less and our consumers are getting their money back in 5 to 6 years, it will serve our purpose. But to understand it in a simple way, for residential customers, we are recommending net metering, and for other customers, we are opting for cross metering. And this is an unstoppable journey, as Abhinav has said. The sooner everybody will understand this, the pain will be less. Otherwise, this journey has started, and within 3-4 years, it will destroy everybody, will not fall in line. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Unstoppable journey. So Kushagra and Neeraj, very quick, what do you want to learn from the other countries? What is the homework we're setting the next session?
How is the storage impacting? One thing I would like to learn is how is the storage evolution impacting, and how are they dealing with, and how the discoms evolving themselves in a new business model. Because we recently heard NextEra, which is part of Florida Power and Light, their market cap has increased much beyond ExxonMobil's market cap. So that is telling much beyond the stories. The new world is coming in, and as Mr. Sinha said, we have to brace ourselves for the new world which is coming in.
Neeraj, last word to you.
Yeah. So very quickly from international experience, as we see with the declining storage cost, in the future there will be more and more off-grid system even in the cities where we have reliable power. So how utilities can really integrate these systems and benefit from this transition rather than losing these consumers altogether. And if I may, quickly comment on the net metering as well. Effectively, net metering is an incentive structure in the form of metering. So somebody is losing money, and it's not the utilities; it's the non-solar consumers who are actually, paying for that cost. So that may become an impediment going forward once we have significant deployment of rooftop solar. So we really need to, think at other mechanisms like what we have done in the VGRS framework. We need to understand other benefits which are offered to these non-solar consumers by the solar consumers, and then have a new mechanism altogether for metering and compensation for the benefit and the cost that is imposed by the rooftop solar. So I will close with that.
Thank you. I could not think of a better panel to really, truly communicate actually to all the participants as well as to the international experts who are going to come on the session now, the appetite that India has for advancing its rooftop solar transition. As all of you have said, it is inevitable. It is only a matter of pace and efficiency. And I think that everything that we've heard today shows that we're all committed to it being sort of the most streamlined, efficient, and quick transition, and hopefully the next session will teach us some tricks of the trade. Wow. Tricks of the trade to how we do that. So thank you very much, and over to you, Hemi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kanika. And this was a great session to talk about opportunities and challenges of Indian rooftop sector. And this leads us to our next panel, which includes the international experiences. And the reason why we brought 4 international experts from Australia, Brazil, Germany, and New York is basically to see how other policymakers, regulators, or stakeholders are trying to deal with the similar challenges that India faced, and you guys talked about it throughout the session 1. And I would like to thank to all our international experts who accepted this invitation, because right now they are connecting from New York to Australia, where in between the time difference is about 15-16 hours. So they made a great effort to stay late at night to basically share with you your experiences. And we have chosen these examples particularly for Indian cases because we thought that if we choose a successful net metering example, which is in this case Brazil, a very advanced distributed PV or rooftop PV policy, and one of the highest penetrations in the world, Australia. And we talked about simplicity. I think this is one thing that is missing in the Indian context, where there are a lot of policies at the central and state level, and everybody mentioned that the implementation is limited. So we will have a simplicity example from Germany. And then, and also another example, which is the most advanced, probably a calculation of value-based, Neeraj and several other speakers talked about, and we will take the New York example at the front of this new way of approaching value-based tariffs in the world. Before overdue, I would like to give the floor to Gabrielle from Australia. She's a DR specialist at the Energy Security Board, and she has been working on these issues for the last 20 years, worked with the North South Wales government, and also worked in the international examples. Gabrielle, big thanks to you to staying very late for us. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours. You have 9 minutes, and you have international speakers have more minutes than the Indian speakers, not to discriminate, because most of the listeners are not familiar with the international examples, so we wanted to give more time for the context, not to be biased. Thank you very much. Gabrielle, the floor is yours, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Jaime, and thank you very much to the IEA for the opportunity to speak with you all today. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I feel I'm in very illustrious company, and I was contemplating how much the language of solar is like the language of mathematics. It's international, so we talk about virtual power plants and virtual net metering in Australia. So hopefully my observations for you will be able to be relevant even if we're talking about a very different context. Particularly on the basis of what the last panel asked to hear about, I could probably talk for several hours, but I'm down to 8 minutes already. So I'm going to focus on 3 things today. I'm going to talk about what we call feed-in tariffs, the discussion about net metering before. I'm going to talk about how we set network revenue in Australia because that's relevant. And I want to talk about, finally, the importance of an overall plan for integrating all distributed energy resources. Before I do that, Dave Turk said that the IEA is a data-driven agency, and I like to think of myself as a data-driven policy advisor. So I will hope you can hear me. I've just got a network advising that I've got network problems, so I'll try and close all my other windows.
We are hearing you well, no problem.
Great, excellent. Yeah. As long as you can see, that's brilliant. So I wanted to give you a sense of scale about Australia. There was discussion about where you're at in India and how things may be taking off. You can see here the graph of small scale PV installations over the years, which really started to take off about 2010, particularly after the introduction of some federal government subsidies. If you click the next button, you'll see the overall picture of where we're at with all of our different forms of generation in Australia now. So we have 25 million people in Australia and almost about 2.5 million households that have rooftop PV systems. So most of the country, you're talking about 25–30% of households with solar, although that varies considerably across the different cities. What's really interesting is we've just passed an interesting solar threshold. This is the data from our Australian energy market operator this year. And you can see if you add up the 3% almost of grid scale solar with the 6% now of rooftop solar, there's 9% there. So solar is now surpassing gas and wind and hydro as a proportion of our electricity generation in Australia, which is quite a fascinating milestone. And if you flick to the next slide, you'll see that that rooftop solar is very significant, obviously, as a proportion of generation, but it's also very significant as a proportion of the jobs in renewable energy. So the figure in brackets afterwards is the number of jobs in Australia. So the latest figures for the last year, 25,000 jobs total nationally, but almost 10,000 of those in small scale solar. Those are largely small firms, only a handful of people, but they're obviously doing a massive amount of solar installations. And one thing people might be interested in is that we expected that during the COVID pandemic that those numbers of installations might fall. But in fact, because people are working from home, the number of installations is rising because people want to have better control over their electricity bills. Next slide, please, which is the last piece of context really in terms of data is to show you the sense of what that rooftop solar aggregated is doing to the balance of decentralized versus centralized capacity. So Bloomberg has estimated that by 2030, 41% of capacity in Australia will sit behind the meter. Now that's capacity, not generation, obviously very different things, but really important to give you a sense of scale. One more slide, please. And I'm glad that this has already been mentioned by at least a couple of other speakers. I think it's really important to understand here that we're not only talking about disruption, but also the digitalization and the democratization. So rooftop solar gives us the opportunity for lower cost supply in some cases and more flexible supply. And it's great to hear already the discussion of rooftop solar replacing CapEx in some network cases, and also the case of using solar in remote communities or in resilient places where resilience is important as part of microgrids. Next slide, please. I'm just going to pause. Excuse me. So the all-important question about who and how pays for the rooftop solar. So there's a very long and complicated history here. But suffice to say, there's been federal government subsidies and also state government subsidies. And these numbers will probably seem quite extraordinary now, but we've had state government subsidies, feed-in tariffs of up to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Now they're generally down to 6 to 12 cents. And the interesting thing is we've had this transition from highly subsidized solar down to retailers setting voluntarily, effectively, the amount that they'll pay to households or C&I customers for the solar fed back into the grid. That does vary greatly, and it's sometimes set to zero, and that's very much dependent on the retailer's portfolio, their risk appetite, their size of their customer base, and how they're managing their portfolio. All our three large retailers also own significant amounts of large-scale generation, but one of those large retailers also sells solar and battery packages to consumers. Next slide, please. Setting network revenue in Australia. So one of this question about how does solar eat into network revenue and how do you deal with the challenges to the changes in economics? We have revenue cap regulation. We move from price cap regulation that's set every 5 years on a propose respond model. So each of the distribution businesses proposes to the Australian Energy Regulator what they'll spend on CapEx, OpEx, and what rate of return they're seeking, and then the regulator makes a determination through an iterative process. Network tariffs are set through tariff structure statements, and those are set annually. Could go into a lot of detail on all of that, but I'll flip through the slides because I do want to get to the next couple of examples. It was great. I think there was a slightly different term used, BGRS, I believe it was. We use, and I'm sure the New York example will talk about beta or beta. So the value of DER through this sort of value stacking method, different parts of the supply chain, you can see there on the left. That's been used, approach has been used to set minimum tariffs in our state of Victoria. But most importantly, I wanted to talk about this new solar sponge network tariff in South Australia. So that's been set at 25% of the normal rate in order to encourage load shifting into the middle of the day to where there's basically that solar trough. Next slide, please. Because before I leave you, I want to talk about the importance of having a plan that takes into account these three different dimensions of DER integration. Really, when we started looking at this, question is DER integration is very complicated. There's many different elements to it, but we've boiled it down to these technical, regulatory, and market-based dimensions. And on the final slide, hopefully. Next one. You'll see what our plan on a page looks like. The Honourable Secretary said right at the beginning about the importance of benefiting all sides and having balance to benefit all sides. Our overall objective is to make sure that we optimise the benefits of DR for all electricity system users. So this is not simply about the people that can afford to own solar, but making sure the benefits of solar are spread across all of the consumers. And I better stop there, but look forward to all the questions.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for this great presentation. I think is a very advanced, especially on the residential sector. And I think distribution companies and the regulation is adapting towards not to, I will say, fight against the rooftop, but accepting it as the new normal, I'm guessing, in Australia. And obviously the regulation type makes an important point on that. Our next speaker is from Brazil, Marco. And the reason why we chose Brazil, because Brazil achieved an incredible deployment success over the last 3 years with the net metering scheme. They installed, I think, about 3 to 3.5 gigawatts in the last 2-3 years. Before that, there was almost nothing in the pipeline. Obviously, this brings a lot of opportunities to the Brazilian system, which is, in terms of the energy losses, not close to the Indian case, but is actually a little bit close to higher than the other OECD countries. That part can be comparable. Marco is working for the electricity regulator of Brazil, ANEEL, who is basically responsible to implement the net metering policy. He's the person who's actually following very closely the impacts of the net metering, both positive and negative terms, both opportunities and challenges. And I'm sure he has a lot of insights to share, especially Brazil is trying to move towards from net metering to new policies. But I think he will mostly talk about the net metering itself as the current policy. Thanks, Marco. The floor is yours.
Hi, Hemi. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Today in Brazil, it's still the morning, but for the other guys, good afternoon and good evening. So it's my pleasure to be here to present the Brazilian experience in regulating the distributed generation. And so I'll focus on net metering scheme. Next slide, please. So ANEEL set the rules in 2012, allowing small-scale generators that use renewables and cogeneration with high energy efficiency to connect to the grid through a consumer facility, and we classify as a microgeneration systems with up to 75 kilowatts and mini generation from 75 to 5,000 kilowatts. And we, under the net metering scheme, energy trade is not allowed. And this picture represents how the system works. So you're probably familiar with the net metering, but in Brazil, when the generation is higher than the consumption, you export to the grid, and this creates a credit, not in money, but it creates a credit in kilowatt hour that can be used to reduce the energy bill in the following 60 months. And there's a minimal fee that it's equivalent to 100 kilowatt hour per month that must be paid by consumers if the generation exceeds the consumption. Next, please. Okay. The business models can be divided into groups. So the first one is the local net metering. So the load and the generation are in the same place. In the first picture you can see traditional rooftop PV, but in the bottom you can see which is a condominium, where could be a residential or commercial condominium where the system could be installed in the common area, and all the units inside this condominium could share the credits of the system. On your on the right, you have the virtual net metering, where you have the load and the generation are not in the same place. In the first picture, you have one consumer with different units. Could be a supermarket, could be household, could be banks. So he can share the credit of his own unit to the other units that he has. And the last one is what we call a virtual net metering with a community power plant, where consumers can join a consortium or a cooperative where they can run their own power plant and share the credit. One thing that is important to highlight that for virtual net metering, load and generation must be supplied by the same utility. Next, please. Next slide, please. So the main outcomes, as you can see in the map of Brazil, we have at least one rooftop PV installed in more than 5,000 cities, which represent 90% of the total cities in the country. In this graph, you can see the evolution of the installed capacity, reaching 3.9 gigawatts of distributed generation, where 90% is PV. And by the end of the year, this number is from September, but by December, we expect to reach 4.4, 4.5 gigawatts. So as we have the virtual net metering, we have difference between the number of connections and the number of consumers that receive the benefits. And in our case, most part of the consumers are low voltage consumers, especially commercial and residential. Next, please. Next slide, please. So what are the main drivers for distributed generation, especially PV in Brazil? The cost of PV system dropped 47% since 2016. And at the same time, the cost of electricity increased 26%. And the tax exemption, there is a tax exemption for energy that is exported and available and affordable funding for consumers. And when you add all these economic incentives with a high level of solar irradiation, so you have a payback period that dropped from 9 years to 4.4 years and now. And consumers can have up to 90% of electricity reduction in their bill. So next slide, please. So how about the challenges? So net metering with a volumetric tariff has huge challenges because there's a compensation of all the tariff components, not only the energy component represent 43%, but also the losses, that's fine, but the charge and transmission system and the distribution system cost. And there's no fixed charge for residential and commercial. And next, please. So there's a pressure on utilities revenue, and this leads to a cost shift to other consumers. There's a cross subsidy here, and this could reach $2 billion in 5 years. And if nothing changes, going to reach $10 billion in 15 years. Next, please. So how ANEEL is addressing the problem? We submit a proposal to a public hearing 1 year ago, and we are planning a transition from net metering to net billing in order to find a value for the distributed generation, avoiding cost shift to consumers and addressing the fixed cost. We have received more than 1,000 suggestions from stakeholders, and the main question that we have is when this transition will start and how many steps until we reach the net billing. Next, please. So how the future is going to be? Well, no one knows, but we can guess. And according to a study from the National Energy Planning for Brazil for 2030, if we keep the current net metering scheme unchanged, in 10 years, we're going to reach almost 36 gigawatts of installed capacity. And if we move to the net billing in 2022, this going to reach 16.8 gigawatts. And this difference represents that $10 billion that we have as a cross subsidy. Next, please. So the positive impacts on job market. According to a recent study from IRENA, Brazil has created about 43,000 jobs last year only for the PV market. Okay, it's pretty good, but it's still 5 times lower than India. But for our case, it's pretty good. And if you see in the map of Brazil on your right side of the screen, you can see that about 3,000 PV suppliers spread all over the country. And that's the great part, the best part of this market, because you can have many cities, small companies, giving job opportunity for everyone. Next, please. Next, please. So what's coming next? So we are preparing the regulatory framework in Brazil for the full deployment of distributed energy resource, allowing the integration not only of distributed generation like PV, but also batteries, electric vehicles, demand response, microgrids, where you can increase your reliability with non-wires alternative, and even virtual power plant. So that's the future that we are heading to. Next, please. Next, please. So thank you, and I leave here my contacts, and I look forward for the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marco, for this presentation. I think it was very to the point in multiple ways, showing the both drivers and challenges, and also a good point on job creation, because this is really another side value that needs to be considered in multiple markets. And now we are moving to a country or a state that basically did the transition from net metering to real-time self-consumption. We call it net meter. The net billing is called in multiple countries. And New York did this transition 2 years ago and created a calculation method which is envied by many in terms of the model for the future of valuation of the distributed PV. And also New York is a particular case because grid expansion and even the maintenance of the grid in terms of the construction is quite expensive. And there is really a value in terms of reducing the load through energy efficiency and self-consumption in certain nodes of New York. Due to significant limited conditions that for the expansion of the grid. And I would like to give the floor to Luke, who is working in NYESERDA, New York's authority, who is basically managing the rolling out of this new scheme. And Luke will talk about what lessons they learned from the transition and how is the situation is going in New York. Thank you very much, Luke. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for the insightful and warm introduction, and thank you for having me here today as a speaker. I've been looking forward to this. I'm going to speak a little bit on New York State's recent experiences. I work for NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, which is a New York State agency renewable energy and energy efficiency, both on the policy side and also in facilitating deployments. New York currently has about 2.5 gigawatts DC of solar PV deployed, and we have about another 2 gigawatts or so currently under an advanced state of development. We have a mandate of seeing 6 gigawatts of PV deployed by the end of 2025. That's an ambitious target for a relatively small state, but I think we're going to get there. So, as you indicated, New York has been recently involved in a transition from net metering towards a more nuanced compensation mechanism. Net metering has a lot of pros, a lot of benefits. It's simple, it's clear, it enables developers and solar customers to know exactly what their savings will be, but there are some shortcomings to net metering as well. There is a cost shift from non-solar customers to customers, and under net metering, it's not fully sustainable. All kilowatt hours are treated the same and compensated the same. So if a customer produces a kilowatt hour of solar energy during an on-peak congested period of the grid, that kilowatt hour is compensated the same as a unit of energy generated when there's lower demand. So we've really been working towards a more nuanced, detailed compensation structure that encourages distributed energy generation during peak times in parts of the grid. This is a very heavy lift for the industry to undertake. And it's taken several years of deliberation with policymakers, investor-owned utilities, developers, energy advocates, and consumer advocates as well. We started this deliberation, I believe, in 2015. There was a public case that was basically guided and overseen by New York State Department of Public Service and Public Service Commission, whereby there were several years of discussion among stakeholders. There were several working groups, and there were multiple white papers and chances for everyone to contribute to the discussion and make their voice heard. In March of 2017, we came out with an official order that eventually became utility tariff into play. It went by the name of Value of Distributed Energy Resources, VDER. The central notion under VDER is that a project's revenue is based on the value of the grid benefits that the energy it produces. So for instance, a kilowatt hour generated in a highly congested part of the grid, for instance, down in New York City, will receive higher compensation kilowatt hour produced in a rural area where there's less demand for that energy. We've had a multi-year rollout of this. VDER first came online for large commercial industrial projects, and also for projects, greater than 750 kilowatts. And we're just now moving to a position where residential projects are slowly transitioning away from net meter. And the ultimate goal here is to provide clear and transparent and predictable price signals so developers will produce distributed energy resources that follow those price signals and produce energy in a way that's most beneficial to the grid. As a result, we're seeing more projects like PV coupled with battery energy storage, PV projects on single axis and dual axis tracking systems that have greater production in the afternoon peak hours when grid and demand are high. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So the value stack isn't a single fixed cent per kilowatt hour compensation structure. It's broken out into a number of components. Project will get the first 4 components, and projects will receive the 5th or the 6th item on the list here. So the distributed energy resource, whether it's solar photovoltaic, small wind, or hydroelectric, will receive the wholesale price of energy, which is set by the wholesale market power plants This is heavily tied to the price of natural gas. Each project also receives a wholesale capacity price, which is structured, cents per kilowatt hour. And then there's something called the demand reduction value, which is a calculated value set by the utility. It's basically calculated as the money the utility company saves by not needing to upgrade transmission lines, distribution lines, and substations. We're putting all the distributed resources on the grid, that is delaying, deferring, or sometimes outright negating the need for the utility to make these expensive upgrades. Therefore, the cost of those offset upgrades is being put back in the compensation to the solar projects. We also have an environmental value in there. That's tied to the social cost of carbon. In the philosophy there is New York State needs to spend less money on healthcare services and basically cleaning up some of the pollution that's offset. So by producing clean energy as opposed to dirty energy from fossil fuels, we're saving that money as a state and as a society, and some of that benefit is structured into this. There's also additional funding available for projects located on extremely congested substations, and there has been a subsidy for community solar as well. So if the developer takes a look at this calculus, which is admittedly pretty complicated, they can take a look and say, oh, I can maximize my wholesale energy price by building in this part of the state as opposed to this part of the state, and I may try to locate on this certain substation. Additionally, they may use battery energy storage to try to maximize their grid injections in a peak period of the day, which typically occurs between 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. for most of our grid. Next slide, please. So we learned a number of lessons going through this stakeholder process, developing this tariff, and then implementing it. First of all, there needs to be very clear communication with all stakeholders, especially project developers. It takes 2 to 3 years typically to develop a megawatt scale project in New York State. So developers need to know, what their compensation will be so they can secure financing, so they can decide whether or not an interconnection cost is worth moving ahead with, and so they can secure customers. Sudden changes and uncertainty about whether or not they'll qualify for certain things will undermine the ability of projects to move forward. Stakeholder engagement was very beneficial. We received a lot of great comments from all parts of the spectrum, private sector, utility, general public. But at some point that discussion needs to be limited and ended. So there were very clear periods whereby people could submit comments, and afterwards the policymakers took those comments and issued an order. Next, it was very important for us to balance a precise compensation structure that had very clear, detailed goals with something that was simple enough whereby developers could actually develop projects. There's such a thing as too much complexity. We initially released that order with too much complexity, and in a revision, we needed to simplify things to provide more transparent and more clear. As in the last bullet, there needs to be a willingness to make revisions, correct things that were not done perfectly. I see I'm at time. I'll wrap up there, but thank you for listening and giving me a chance to speak.
Thank you very much, Luke. I think you finished at a very important point of complexity, the balance of complexity. And this leads us to the other speaker who actually will talk about a little bit about simplicity of the policies. Obviously, we cannot skip Germany during a distributed PV workshop because Germany achieved one of the fastest growing or one of the largest distributed PV fleet in the world, mostly at the commercial scale of applications, which is quite large, and it continues to grow. And the success of Germany was without net metering, Many of the previous speakers referred to net metering as a kickoff option, while Germany basically chose another route initially, but also bringing the policy a little bit more complicated right now for the integration of rooftop systems to the electricity markets. So I would like to invite Stefan Arendt, who works for the German energy regulator, BNETZA, and basically within the unit of the responsible for incentive regulation and benchmarking. And he's basically an expert on this topic and was involved in I will say, rule setting or implementation. Stefan, the floor is yours for your presentation. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I hope you hear me very well. It was quite interesting to listen to all the presentations before. So I got a good overview of what's happening in India, but also happened in other countries all over the world. Today I will give you some insights of what the development of renewables in Germany was driven by, about the policies and the support schemes and developments come from the decisions in the past. So I guess we can directly go to the second slide. Yeah, to know something first, because it was addressed that we do not use net metering in the past. That's because of we as regulatory authority were faced with two challenges in the last 2 decades of energy market development. The first one was, both were given by the policymakers, by the parliament, but the first one was to create competition in a market which is, from a natural perspective of development, more or less in the most countries a very monopolistic organized, or at least oligopolistic organized market. So one of our tasks as regulatory authority was to set up a regulatory and legal framework to increase competition, and the other task was the development of the renewables. And in a long discussion, in a long political and regulatory discussion, we decided to go into a system of feed-in tariffs first, which I will explain later on. So our main task is, as regulatory authority, to set the level playing field for market stakeholders. And for us, market stakeholders are also the renewable development, the renewable generators and the development projects of renewables. Next slide, please, or directly to slide 4, please. Yeah, this picture, just imagine what's our task right now and our aims for the future. So showing the state of the art in 2020 in Germany. So we are today in a situation in which the renewables are higher, or the renewable energy infeed is higher than 40% of the total energy consumption over a year. We're talking about 70, almost 80% of the primary energy consumption of Germany, and the political targets, medium-term targets, are shown in the picture. So more than 65% of energy production in 2030, and 30% of the primary energy consumption, and even increase in the 2015 targets, whereas the political aim is to be climate neutral. Next slide, please. So we start this journey, I would call it journey, of renewable development in Germany in end of 1990s. So as you may know, in 1998 we had a new government with the Social Democratic and the Green parties, and they decided to introduce the so-called Renewable Energy Law. We call the short in Germany is EEG, which was introduced in 2000 and set by law feed-in tariffs for different technologies of renewable. namely PV rooftop and PV installations in general, wind onshore and offshore, and biomass. And we keep this system until 2012. So in this 12 years period, we operating with feed-in tariffs only. Afterwards, from 2012 on, the system was switched to a feed-in premium system as pilot project. I will describe later on. From 2040 on, we go into feed-in premium system first. So the majority of renewable installations are subsidized by a feed-in premium system, which was amended by auctioning process in 2017. But, and that's also important for small-scale rooftop installation, we still set in place a feed-in tariff for the household owners, because the system we implemented from 2012 on is much more complicated than the one for smaller installations. Next slide, please. And the fundamentals of this Renewable Energy Act and the feed-in tariff system was quite simple. The basic idea was, because in this time nobody had any experience, any high experience of how to handle this, was to implement a very simple system. And the feed-in tariff system is quite simple from that way that you get as household or as developers, as REST developers, but the majority was household owners, get 2 meters, an in-feed meter, which counts the electricity you feed into the network, and your consumption meter. And the idea was quite simple, to set a fixed tariff for any kilowatt hour you put into the network. And it was a pure produce and forgot scheme. So you just put on your rooftop installation, producing energy, and you get cash from the system operator at last. The level was fixed for 20 years, and we as regulatory authority set the framework that you had guaranteed access to the grid and priority dispatch. So if there are trouble in the network, the dispatch of the renewable is the last the system operator is allowed to do so. Next slide, please. Yeah, and what happened over time, it's quite simple. This support scheme was that successful that it becomes simply quite expensive. So actually, we're talking about almost 25 billion euro of subsidies per year, meaning per kilowatt hour close to 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And the politician makers has to stop this high development. Next slide, please. Because it was not that simple, this system, because almost annually in the past we had to adjust the subsidy levels by law. So at this graph, especially the blue one is interesting. It's the subsidy level per kilowatt hour and the development over the last couple of years. And these steps are always the change of the law, the guaranteed sets by law. And as I said, in 2012, we switched the system. And in this switch, we also make an agreement into the law that the value of subsidies is dependent on the evaluation of the renewable installation amount, so that the subsidies simply does not increase in this high level as before. Next slide, please. But a much more important issue was from a market perspective that the feed-in tariffs are produce and forgot tariffs, and implies a huge burden to the system operator with respect to the balancing of the overall energy system. And therefore, we switched to the so-called feed-in premium, which is in its design price reactive and give the balancing responsibility to the owner of the renewable installation. Next slide, please. Or maybe directly skip this slide. I go to the next and describe the feed-in premium tariff. So the feed-in premium system is a quite simple one. In the first step, it was guaranteed by law a fixed value, so-called reference value. At this slide, it's the example of the onshore wind energy. It was a guaranteed value of 9 cents per kilowatt hour. And our task as regulatory authority was now for every month, check the market price for the specific electricity at the wholesale market. Let's say, as an example, in the last month, it was September, it was 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Then we calculated the smart market premium, 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And the idea is quite simple. If the owner of the renewable energy generation facility sell his energy for, in an average, 3.5 cents again, get this smart market premium, and is guaranteed to earn 9 cents per kilowatt hour. And we adjust this every month. So, for example, if it increased in October for 4.5 cents or for 4 cents per kilowatt hour, we set the market premium to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And the idea is quite simple. If the energy is cheap on the market, and we observed in the past, for instance, negative energy prices, the idea is that the owner may stop the infeed of his renewable production, so reduce the burden on the system, on the overall system. The same is true if the price increases, let's say for 7 cents per kilowatt hour, the smart market premium is still fixed. So in times of scarcity, he can earn more money. Yeah, next slide, please. And the last step on our way was to set, in the first step, this reference value was set by law. And in the last step, we're going into an auctioning system. And so the project developers and owners of renewable development, renewable generation facility, make an auctioning process on this reference value. And here you can see the development for rooftop installations. So we're now at a level of almost 5 cents per kilowatt hour as a so-called guaranteed value, which is almost comparable to the market value. So we're talking, for instance, at the wind onshore of no subsidies anymore. But again, because of this guarantee by law for 20 years, we have a high burden of the past of a huge amount of renewable subsidies in our whole system. Yeah, maybe going to the question rounds now, because I guess a lot of questions are open.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Stefan. I would like to invite all the speakers to turn on their cameras and microphones. And in order to have a quick discussion, I collected some questions here, myself and a few others from the speakers. If you want to ask questions, please type that in the question box, as in the other session. I'd like to start actually a question to everybody. The biggest discussion we realized in India is the distribution companies and how they will survive through this distributed PV deployment. And we have regulators, 3 regulators here who deal with distribution companies daily. And I don't know, Luke, if it's under your responsibility, the regulation, I'm not sure, that's why I didn't mention you, but I would like to ask whether in your country example, these policy transitions that you talked about change the perception of utilities looking at distributed PV and how to adapt towards making distributed PV more profitable for them and taking advantage of it. I would like to start with Gabrielle. She mentioned that any retailer can set its own tariff to buy solar PV. How did you come to that really advanced situation, and how is the situation with distribution here? What will be the key message that you will give to India about this?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the short answer is how we came to it is probably through quite a lot of trial and error. Other people can commentate on how much was trial and how much was error. But I guess for me, it's the question about distribution businesses and how they look at PV is such an interesting one that I think is best understood in the broader context of all distributed energy resources. I was very fortunate to do a Churchill Fellowship where I looked at the future of electricity distribution businesses in Europe and North America. And what really struck me is everyone said distribution businesses, business models haven't changed for 100 years. They have been transporting electrons from large generators to people's homes and businesses, and that's all they've done. So I think one of the things that's really challenging about solar PV is that that completely changes the business model. But I think what's really exciting is when you merge that it's not just about solar PV, it's this fundamental disruption about the democratization and the digitization, and that in fact provides opportunities for some of the innovative companies and distribution businesses we've heard about from India and obviously happening elsewhere to really come in and provide better services for consumers. And I think if we look at just PV, then it's easy to focus on what are the challenges with that. But when you start bringing in particularly electric vehicles or stationary storage or energy efficiency, you know, various forms of demand management or demand response, then you see we've got a far more complicated ecosystem. But that's also huge opportunities, particularly for innovative companies that are able to work with the digitization to optimize the benefits of all these distributed resources we now have throughout the system. And I think obviously the challenges then, and for everyone, I guess, is for the regulation to keep up with that technological and commercial change. The regulation tends to lag behind. And then there's another whole conversation about moving really to performance-based or outcomes-based regulation for those distribution businesses. So I'll pause there. Happy to talk more about any of that though.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I would like to address the same question to Marco. There's a specific question for you as well about why do you expect smaller growth of distributed PV after the net billing in the projections by the EPE? That's the one specific question. If you can answer quickly, that will be great. But I wanted to ask you, as Gabrielle mentioned in her presentation, that there is a high fixed component of the tariff. She showed on her slide that they basically get from the consumers already without consuming any power. It's a fixed fee. In Brazil, as far as I know, and also in New York, I will bring this to you as well. In Germany, the fixed component of the tariff is extremely low, and everything is variable, basically charged. And Marco, do you see a tariff reform needed along with this kind of a change in the net billing in the coming years? And as a regulator, do you see this coming up with the new distributed resources deployment? Thank you. I think Marco is frozen. I think he will reconnect. Luke, can I turn to you then with the same question?
Yes, sir.
With the same question that do you expect, how was the change in the distribution company's perception when you changed the regulation from net metering? And do you see that retail tariffs are changing to adopt all these new innovation into the grid, electric vehicles and all this digitalization going forward?
Sure. So there's a lot there. I'd just like to point out, that in New York State, we do have a strong centralized regulator in the Department of Public Service and Public Service Commission. So they basically set out orders which the investor-owned utilities need to follow. So ideally, we want to get everyone on the same page. We want to get utilities philosophically aligned and provide them reasons to want to take certain actions. But at the end of the day, they just need to follow the orders set out by the policymakers. That being said, there were two steps in particular taken to really engage the utilities. We really brought them in during the design of the meter structure. So they provided plenty of feedback. They provided plenty of calculations. So we were able to really set a lot of rates, in close alignment with their costs. The other important thing is we set the meter structure to be cost neutral with utilities. So in other words, it takes them, 10 cents to acquire and deliver a kilowatt hour of energy to their customers. They would essentially pay that same 10 cents to a solar producer that produce that same kilowatt hour. So the utility is not really seeing a true loss of revenue. They're just shifting what they would put into, producing that kilowatt hour, whether it's acquiring from a wholesale producer or putting upgrades into a substation, so that kilowatt hour could be supported on the distribution network. They're essentially shifting those payments to the distributed energy resources like solar.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's a very interesting way of win-win case, maybe, that you are trying to create in order to not to create effects on both sides. Marco, did you hear my question? I think you did, then you got lost.
Yes, I heard, but when I will start speaking, the connection issue, sorry. So first, about the specific question about the PV projection. The differences between the normal projection, keeping the net metering rules, that the net metering, current net metering values the energy with the retail price, the full cost of electricity, including tax. And with the net billing, the energy will be valued by the cost that is this utility that buys this energy from generators plus losses. So it will reduce, let's say, 50% of the cost of the price of the electricity. And then the payback period would increase from 4 years to 6.5, 7 years. So that's the difference between the two projections. And about the first question.
The retail tariffs, because when you continue deploying the distributed PV under net metering scheme, obviously the grid costs are not shared in a same way. And I mentioned that in Australia there's a high fixed charge on the customer's bill, and in Brazil it's close to zero, as far as I remember. Everything is variable charge. Do you see the regulation adapting to retail price changes in the coming future to adapt to this distributed PV deployment in Brazil, or you will see the structure on the remuneration side?
Yeah, this is a big challenge right now. We need to, the PV is not a problem. We have to restructure our tariff so utilities can recover their cost, and we can keep this deployment of PV and other distributed generation. And so we have to restructure our tariff system to make it, yes, the fixed cost is close zero, and that's a big issue for low voltage consumers. But for industrial consumers with high voltage, they pay a binomial tariff, so they recover their cost. It's not a problem. But the low voltage consumers is a big issue. But we can see an opportunity for utilities. Not only for PV, but when you add storage, and then you can create microgrids, and then you can increase your reliability. Reliability is a big issue in Brazil, so we have to increase our reliability, and then utilities can use distributed energy resource as non-wires alternatives, reducing their cost. So that's the point that I put in my last slide. So that's what we are heading. I think could be a win-win solution, not only for consumers. Nowadays, it's very good for consumers who install PV, but for the others, they will pay the bill. So we have to move forward and change this balance. But we still have issues on how to balance the incentives. That's the point. But the future is not only PV, but the whole distributed energy resource that we have in our country.
Thank you very much, Marco. Stefan, Do you think you found the right balance in Germany between consumers, regulator, distribution, maintenance, and basically retailers that are all playing in the same field? Do you think you found the simplest policy, is it a simple policy, the right balance between the three? I know this is a very difficult question for a regulator to ask, but at least if you can give your perspective, that will be very well appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah. It's simple. It depends on which market stakeholder you ask. No, yeah, indeed, it's from a regulatory perspective, it's a quite heavy task in Germany right now, because we do not have only to fulfill the renewable targets, but also to keep in mind that we have to fulfill we call it integrative market targets. So our aim is always to create an European integrated energy market with the long-term target that I can buy my energy as well in Finland or Estonia, whatever I want to. And that's a heavy task to keep this in mind by creating or ensuring this renewable development. And therefore, I said our aim was to focusing on this monopolistic market. As you may know, I visited also Australia some couple of years ago, and therefore I know in Australia they know this development as well very well. We have to ensure that we also keep in mind this task of, we call it unbundling. So our overall aim is to ensure that the distribution in India, it's called the distribution companies, I guess, Discom. Our aim is that they really focus on their core business, and that's simply distribution or transportation of energy. In Germany, for instance, the larger the companies, we call it DSOs and TSOs. DSOs are more local level and regional one, and TSOs are transportation system operator. For instance, they are not allowed to own any kind of generation facility. Yeah? They are only system providers, and all the other market participants can act on this level playing field we created. And therefore, to answer your question from a regulatory perspective, we find the right balance of who is responsible for what and what is possible in the market. For instance, examples of net metering we observed simply as a service provider. Now, we do not offer this from a regulatory perspective, but we created a level playing field where the companies offer to consumers owning rooftop installation to have a kind of net metering. Yeah? But it's artificial. It's not the system itself guaranteed this. But to answer the question and follow, it was a heavy way to reach this target. We have a burden of, I said, 25 billion euros per year of subsidies. We pushing through the system the next couple of years until the guarantee by law is running out, and therefore it was a heavy way. But now we reached a level in which the competition level is very high, and also the development of renewables is quite well.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask one last question to all participants, and I need to close the session. We'll do the quick wrap up. Gabriel, what will be the one suggestion that you will give to Indian governments or any specific state on the acceleration of the rooftop PV? If you had to give one or two advice very quickly, please. Thank you.
I think having that plan about integrating DER in terms of technical, regulatory and market, and considering all of those dimensions, and also not just thinking about PV. I really think, and the last few months I've been increasingly focused on electric vehicles, because we tend to think solar, 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 and that's been our sole focus. But as soon as you get mass take-up of electric vehicles, and I think India is far ahead of Australia on this, then you've got the balancing technology. EVs have got the advantage that they're larger than stationary storage generally in terms of the capacity, that they are mobile, so you can move them to different parts of the grid, and there's lots of different kinds of EVs. So buses fleet, for example, have been shown to, in trials, to be really flexible and really useful. And obviously, that's how you decarbonise your transport system at the same time and reduce local air pollution. So I think the thinking about it in terms of it's not just about rooftop solar, but the complementary technologies to make the best use of the PV and across those areas of technical, regulatory and market integration.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, and thanks for keeping up with the panel until midnight almost in Australia. Thank you. Luke, what will be your suggestion for the Indian stakeholders that are watching us for them to, with your experience, in order to achieve this balance or accelerate the distributed PV, because they have a very ambitious goal?
Yes, I'd say my number one piece of advice would be speak with the project developers, understand exactly what they need to take a project completion. Whether it's certainty in compensation rates, so they can model the revenue and show that to their investors, whether it's assistance with permitting. If the developers don't have the certainty and the tools they need to take these projects through, then you'll see a heavy attrition of projects that don't get built, they get canceled during your first or second or third year of development. So it's important to have those discussions in front.
Policy certainty, very clear for the developers. Marco.
Well, if I would say something, I would say be careful with subsidies. It's very easy to give, very difficult to get rid of. So so you have to plan ahead and say by that year the subsidy will drop, and you have to follow your plan. And that's something that we are suffering now. And I would like to advise, be careful.
Thank you. And Stefan, I saw you laughed. It's
yeah.
Please, what will be your last words, sir?
Yeah, I guess that's because Marco is also from a regulatory authority. I would also really to give one idea to the Indian colleagues. Please monitor and review your subsidy system almost every year, because in the long run, as Marco said, it becomes more and more money of subsidies in the system. And once you try to fight against subsidy or to reduce, it becomes quite heavy. You will fight against a lot of stakeholders who wants to simply earn money. So a continuous monitoring and review of the subsidies, of the success and the costs may avoid such difficult discussions in the future.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you very much for taking the time to participate into the session too. I'm sorry for a little bit of delay because of the first session, but thank you very much. Extremely valuable. Now we are moving to wrap-ups. I would like to bring Mr. Jagdale and Paolo Frankel back to the floor. If they can turn on their cameras, I will give the floor to them for a quick summary of the wrap-up of the session, and then I guess we will close. Mr. Jagdale, please, the floor is yours after a long day probably for you. Sorry for the delay, but I think it was useful. The floor is yours for some of your takeaways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hemi, and good evening to all. I think whatever delay has occurred was on account of getting more and more information about the perspectives of the different countries, especially the Australia, Germany, Brazil, and US, and all this good discussions will be an excellent point of homework for all of us to take forward. Before I really wrap up, I want to thank IEA and CEW for putting an excellent workshop today here on unlocking the economic potential of rooftop solar in India. Secretary Sir has rightly put up the trend in terms of the tremendous potential of solar rooftop that we have as a country, India has. And obviously with the figures close to between 4 to 5 gigawatt of achievement, we still have a long way to go. And MNRE, as we all have listened and heard, we are fully committed towards achieving this target, and we are working towards enabling various mechanisms that can enable this growth across the different sectors, right from the residential to industrial, and of course, with the full confidence and faith of the distribution companies in India. So today, the workshop has presented some great international best practices from countries running from successful solar rooftop programs, and there are learnings that would support that is India's growth in accelerating the rooftop PV deployment. So basically what we learned is the maintaining the operational and financial viability of discoms, as in the first session we talked about, and few of the states also represented their case. Obviously, the financial viability of discoms is critically important for the success of rooftop. But the session also demonstrated, yes, the solar rooftop could be beneficial to the discoms with innovative business models and right policies and regulations. We heard Germany, US, Australia, and Brazil showed that distributed PE policies could be designed to address various challenges, including the revenue losses, the perceived revenue losses of the distribution companies. And by properly mitigating those areas, we could devise. So that's a learning phase. I think we all will be beneficial from this particular exercise of today's. Distributed photovoltaic systems could provide multiple benefits, as we listen, including making the grids more flexible and reducing the losses, as we understand, basically improving the grid stability, providing innovative compensation, and bringing more and more the generators closer to the users. So that's how the rooftop provides an innovative advantage. So distributed PV, all apart from the socioeconomic benefits that we talk about, has a great potential for job generation. And in this era of pandemic, where we all have a full focus and attention on creating more jobs, solar distributed photovoltaic across sectors provides more and more and good opportunities to enhance the opportunities of employment, and that too across the distributed sector. It's not only fully concentrated in a particular zone or an area, but it gives an immense opportunity to look at distributed sectors. So lastly, I think from MNRE's perspective, we are strongly working towards the targets and designing our programs and policies along with the consensus of states to increase the distributed photovoltaic deployment. We remain committed to our goals and targets, and with every possible support to the states and investors, we would enhance the clean energy transition. And that's what I think is the biggest takeaway from here. We will continue to work with IEA and CW on this aspect, and take more and more inputs from the stakeholders to make the program more friendly, more reliable, and the targets more achievable. So thank you, Paulo, for this, and look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jagdale. And it's my turn to make some conclusion remarks on a very informative workshop. I learned many things today, and to be honest, I will need some time to digest them all. But I think the workshop highlighted how huge the potential of distributed PV, while not neglecting what the challenges exist. I take some words said by Kanika. This is inevitable. It's just a matter of pace and efficiency, and I totally agree with that. I take the words of the secretary to strive for balance. I think that's the real challenge ahead of us. And I would add, from my point, I think there is no one fits all solutions. We will have different models in different contexts, and we will also have to accept trial and errors patterns, as our Australian colleague said very frankly. Now, let me highlight 4 points that I take away, and I really apologize if I neglect other important things, but these to me are really important right now. First, this notion of finding a compromise between the interests of discoms and prosumers, with the difference of complexity versus simplicity. Now, starting with the discoms, I was very pleased to see a number of proposals for innovative business models prepared by CEW with the stakeholders. I definitely see with attention the models that see the limits of net metering in the classical understanding and look at more value-based models and those kind of solutions. The second point, which has really hit my attention, is to find this compromise between complexity and simplicity. The end consumers, in particular the households, the residential, they need to have a simple tariff, a simple offer. They don't want to spend a huge amount of time in understanding all the complexities which are behind the value of distributed PV. This is a task more for regulators, so the tariffs can be the result of a very complex analysis, or of competition. And I heard very attentively the intervention of Australia saying actually the biggest opportunities for the distribution companies and the retailers will come when you don't look just at distributed PV, but at the whole set of distributed energy resources. Electric vehicles were mentioned, batteries were mentioned. I would add heat pumps, demand-side response devices, heat pumps with thermal storage that can provide additional flexibility. I think there will be huge opportunities for companies in the distribution space. Third point, I liked the presentation that looked at different market segments. We cannot pretend that we solve the issues and the challenges of distributed PV in all segments at the same time. And I think there are preferential ones. And I also like the fact of focusing in some cases on the governmental buildings to give the examples and to show the way forward, maybe before other private customers come. And my last point, I believe very much in examples. People love to follow good examples. And I love the idea for India, as in other places, to work with champions, to work with discoms that are, for one reason or another, are more proactive than others because they show the way to the others as well. To work with the developers which have better innovative ideas because they show the way to the others. And I think there is a great work to be done here in terms also of new ideas like group and virtual net metering. We really had a lot of ideas, both from the Indian stakeholders and from the international stakeholders today, and I really appreciate that. Let me just conclude by expressing my thanks to you, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energies, the presence of your secretary, of two joint secretaries. You are now visible, but I thank you all. Of course, to our colleagues of CEW for the enormous preparatory work, but also for the very nice ideas in this field. And last, certainly but not least, to my colleagues, first Dave Turk, but also Hemi and Kartik, to setting an excellent workshop, in my opinion, which we will need some time to fully digest. I look forward to continuing this collaboration with the government of India, with the states, with CEW, with the international countries. And I think it is also important to look at distributed PV, but also enlarge the scope to distributed energy resources. I really thank you for an excellent day and workshop. I myself learned and heard many new things, and I want to express the gratitude for such spending these hours with all of you. Thank you so much, and thank you in particular for those who are with us in the middle of the night and for joining us in this exercise. Very good afternoon, night for all concerned. Thank you so much from my part in Paris. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amy.
Yes, thank you very much. We are close.
Yes, very good. Thank you.
All the participants and for your attention, and hope to see you in the next ones. Have a good evening, morning, and day.
Thank you.